For a long time, I thought I had it all. My name's Jake, and I had a life many would envy. I'd worked hard to build my career, working my way up from a small-time accountant to a well-respected financial advisor. I had a beautiful home in the suburbs, the kind of place where you could hear the birds chirping in the morning, and the front lawn was perfectly manicured. Every inch of it screamed success. But none of that mattered as much to me as one thing: my wife, Emily. I met her when we were both in college. She was the kind of woman that made everyone stop and stare. Stunningly beautiful, but with an elegance that came from within, not just from her appearance. She had this warmth that made you feel like the most important person in the room. I knew from the moment we met that she was the one. We'd been married for 10 years. 10 years. 10 years of love, laughter, late-night talks, vacations, and moments that felt straight out of a movie. There was something about our relationship that felt unshakable, like it had been written in the stars. I had no doubts. Our marriage wasn't perfect, of course. We had our ups and downs, just like any couple. But I never once questioned that we were a team. Every problem we faced together. Every victory, we celebrated together. I loved her more than anything. She was my heart, my soul, my everything. She was the one person I could count on no matter what. And I thought, with everything in me, that she felt the same. But then one night, everything changed. It started off just like any other evening. We were sitting at the kitchen table, eating dinner, something simple, but the way Emily smiled at me made it feel like the world was perfect. We were laughing about something silly, just like we always did. And yet, there was something different in the air. There was an unspoken tension, a distance that I couldn't explain. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. But I felt it. I could sense that something was wrong, even if Emily didn't say it. She'd been distant lately. Not physically, but emotionally. There was something in her eyes when she looked at me, like she was looking through me rather than at me. She would leave the room for a minute, then come back and act like nothing had happened. When I'd ask if something was bothering her, she'd brush it off with a smile and a quick, "I'm fine, just tired." At first, I thought it was just stress. She'd been working more lately, staying late at the office. I told myself that maybe she was just burned out. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I knew. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew. There was something off about Emily, something she wasn't telling me. And as the days passed, the tension only grew. The familiar rhythm of our life together was becoming jagged. I'd catch her staring at her phone in a way that seemed secretive. She'd become evasive when I asked about her day, almost as if she was hiding something. I tried to push those thoughts away, but they kept creeping back in. I told myself that I was being paranoid, that everything was fine, that I was overthinking things. But every time I looked into her eyes, it felt like she was slipping away from me, and I couldn't figure out why. Looking back now, I should have known. The signs were all there. But at the time, I was blinded by love and trust. I thought I was living the dream. I thought nothing could touch us. But one night, I would find out just how wrong I was. It started with a quiet evening. Emily had said she was meeting up with a friend. It was supposed to be a simple night out, just some time for her to unwind. I didn't think much of it. But when I kissed her goodbye, something about the way she looked at me felt different. There was a coldness in her eyes. Or maybe it was just the way she quickly averted her gaze when I tried to hold her for a second longer than usual. That night, everything changed. The last thing I remember thinking as I watched her drive away was that I didn't want to be paranoid. I didn't want to second-guess everything. But I should have trusted that nagging feeling in my gut. Because from that night on, nothing would ever be the same. My perfect life would shatter in ways I could never have imagined. And I would come to realize that the woman I loved, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, was hiding a secret so devastating it would leave me questioning everything. But I had no idea that what I was about to discover would destroy everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and loyalty. The story doesn't end here. The first cracks in my perfect life appeared so subtly, I almost missed them. It was a small shift, barely noticeable at first. Emily, my wife, the woman I trusted with my heart, started acting different. Nothing too obvious, nothing overt, just these little changes that I couldn't ignore. It began with her being busy all the time. More than usual, that is. She had always been a dedicated worker, but this was different. She'd come home late, later than she ever had before, and when I asked her about it, her answers were always quick and vague. "Oh, it's just a project deadline. Just wrapping up some things at the office. Sorry, I didn't mean to keep you waiting." At first, I brushed it off. She'd been under a lot of pressure at work recently. It was normal, right? But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But the changes didn't stop there. Her phone. Her phone started to become her lifeline. She had always been someone who casually checked her messages, maybe a text or two while we were watching TV. But now, she'd keep it in her hand all the time, even when we were together. It was like she couldn't bear to be more than a few feet away from it. I started noticing something else too. When I'd walk into the room, she'd quickly lock the screen, her fingers moving with lightning speed to put it down. And if I asked, "Who's that?" she'd answer so quickly, her voice a little too rehearsed. "Oh, just a work email. Nothing important." I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the small twitch of her lips, like she was hiding something. But when I would press for more details, she'd just shake her head, dismissing it with a soft laugh. "You're so paranoid." The more she dismissed my concerns, the more my instincts started to scream. Something wasn't right. I tried to tell myself that I was being irrational. I trusted her. We had a perfect marriage, a life built on love, respect, and years of shared memories. Why would she do anything to jeopardize that? But the unease gnawed at me like a slow, relentless burn. There was also the way she avoided eye contact. Emily had always been the kind of woman who could look you in the eye and speak from the heart. But lately, she started avoiding my gaze, looking out the window when we'd talk or down at her lap when I asked her something serious. Every time I reached out to hold her hand, her fingers would slip away too quickly, like she didn't want me to feel the coldness that was creeping into her touch. And then there were the evenings she came home late. There was no longer any dinner waiting for me when I walked in, no soft smile, no laugh as she asked me about my day. She'd barely be home for a few hours before slipping back into the night, saying she was meeting a friend for drinks or going to a work event. The thing is, Emily was always the person who was happiest at home, who enjoyed cozy nights in with a glass of wine, catching up on the shows we loved to watch together. We'd spend hours in the kitchen, cooking meals for ourselves, talking about our dreams, our future. But now, it was like those moments no longer mattered to her. I could feel the distance growing. It wasn't a huge gap, just a small, insidious thing that crept up between us. At first, it didn't even register. It was just life, I told myself. People get busy, right? Things change. But there was one night, one small, seemingly insignificant moment, that would forever change the way I saw her. I came home early from work one evening. I thought I'd surprise her with dinner, something I hadn't done in a while. I walked in the door, and there she was, sitting on the couch, her eyes glued to her phone. I smiled, excited to see her. "Hey, babe, I'm home early. How was your day?" She didn't look up. "Just fine," she said, her voice cold, absent. I frowned. That was the first time in a while she hadn't even bothered to look up when I came in. I could see her scrolling quickly, her thumb flying across the screen. When she finally did look up, it wasn't the usual smile, the usual warmth. She gave me a quick, tight smile before looking back at her phone again. That's when I noticed it, the secretive nature of it all. She wasn't just texting like she usually did. She was typing, but so fast, so furtively that I couldn't make out a single word on the screen. And when I walked over to sit beside her, she immediately locked the phone and put it down by her side. It hit me then like a punch to the stomach. I was being shut out. She was shutting me out, I didn't know what was happening, but I felt the truth creeping in. I couldn't just ignore the signs anymore. My wife, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, was keeping something from me. The worst part? I didn't even know what it was yet. That night, I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. What was going on? Was she really cheating on me? Was there someone else? But the answer didn't matter, because deep down I knew I had to face the facts. This wasn't just some innocent change. Something was wrong, something was off. And no matter how much I tried to push the thought away, the fear gnawed at me like a predator stalking its prey. I had to find out the truth. It was a quiet evening, one of those nights when everything seemed perfectly normal, too normal. The soft hum of the television filled the living room as Jake absent-mindedly scrolled through his phone. He could hear the sound of running water from the bathroom. Emily was in the shower, singing softly, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Then it happened. A bright glow from Emily's phone, resting on the nightstand, caught Jake's attention. At first, he ignored it. After all, they trusted each other, didn't they? But then, another notification, and another. His gut twisted into a tight knot. A name flashed on the screen, one he didn't recognize. Curiosity, or maybe something darker, took hold of him. He reached for the phone with trembling hands, his heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. He hesitated for a moment, knowing he was about to cross a line. But the feeling in his stomach, that gnawing doubt, was too strong to ignore. Jake unlocked the phone. What he saw made his blood run cold. A stream of messages filled the screen, flirty, suggestive, and far too intimate to be just friendly. His pulse roared in his ears as he scrolled further. There were photos, selfies of Emily, some of them taken in their very own bedroom. Some of them much worse. His stomach churned. But the real dagger to his heart was the name attached to these messages. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some random guy from work or a fling she met online. It was his best friend, Tyler, the man who had been in his life for over a decade. The guy who had helped him move into this apartment. The same man who stood beside him at family gatherings, laughing and drinking beers as if they were brothers. Betrayal wasn't just a word at that moment. It was a living, breathing thing, wrapping itself around Jake like a vice. His hands shook as he kept scrolling, reading every sickening message, every confession of desire, every plan to meet behind his back. Then he saw it, a message from Emily just a few hours ago. "I can't wait to see you tonight. Same hotel." The timestamp confirmed it. She had planned to meet Tyler after dinner. Jake felt the room spin. His chest tightened. Was this really happening? How long had this been going on? Had everything between them been a lie? The sound of the shower turning off snapped him back to reality. He barely had time to process before Emily stepped into the room, wrapped in a towel, smiling as if nothing had changed. But for Jake, everything had. His world had just collapsed. And Emily had no idea that he knew everything. What happens next? Jake had a choice to make. Confront her now, or play along until he had the upper hand. One thing was certain. This wasn't over. The night had been like any other. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Emily had kissed Jake on the cheek before heading out to meet a friend for drinks. He had trusted her. He had no reason not to, until tonight. Jake sat on the couch, the glow of the television barely registering in his mind. Something gnawed at him, an unease he couldn't shake. He wasn't the jealous type, never the paranoid boyfriend. But tonight something felt off. Maybe it was the way Emily had rushed out, barely looking him in the eye. Maybe it was how she had clutched her phone tighter than usual, her fingers hovering over the screen like she was hiding something. And then his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "I thought you should know. Emily is with Mark. The hotel on 5th. Jake's blood turned to ice. Mark, his best friend, his brother in everything but blood. The man who had been by his side through every storm. The one who had pulled him from the darkest moments of his life. The one who had once sworn that loyalty meant everything. Jake's hands trembled as he reread the message, his mind racing through 1,000 memories. Every night they had all hung out together, every laugh, every beer they had shared. Had it all been a lie? How long had this been going on? His breathing grew ragged, his fists clenching so hard his nails dug into his palms. He needed proof. He needed to see it with his own eyes. With a sharp inhale, Jake grabbed his keys and stormed out the door. The hotel on Fifth wasn't a luxury spot. It was discreet, tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place people went when they wanted to stay hidden. Jake parked a block away, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He didn't even remember the drive. His mind had been drowning in anger, betrayal, and a raw pain that clawed at his chest. Inside, the hotel lobby smelled of stale perfume and old carpet. The receptionist barely looked up as Jake strode past, heading straight for the elevators. He didn't even know what room he was looking for until he saw them. The doors slid open on the 4th floor, and there they were. Emily, Mark, standing in the dimly lit hallway, too caught up in each other to notice him at first. Emily's hands were on Mark's chest, her fingers gripping his shirt as she whispered something against his neck. Jake felt like he had been punched in the gut. Mark, his best friend, the man he would have trusted with his life. And now this? Emily turned. Her eyes widened in horror when she saw Jake. Mark spun around, guilt flashing across his face. Jake! But Jake didn't want to hear a damn word. The pain, the rage, the betrayal, it all erupted inside him like a firestorm. He surged forward, his knuckles colliding with Mark's jaw before he even realized he had thrown a punch. Mark staggered back, clutching his face. You were my brother. Jake's voice was raw, shaking with fury. And you do this to me? Emily was already crying, stepping between them. Jake, please, let me explain. But he wasn't listening. The truth was standing right in front of him, and it was uglier than he had ever imagined. Mark wiped the blood from his lip, his expression twisted with guilt and something else, shame. I didn't mean for this to happen. Jake let out a bitter laugh. You didn't mean to sleep with my girlfriend? Or you didn't mean to get caught? Silence. Emily sobbed, reaching for Jake, but he pulled away like her touch burned him. It was over. Not just his relationship, not just his love for Emily, his friendship, his trust in the people closest to him. Everything had shattered. And now, all that remained was the wreckage of a betrayal he would never forget. The silence between them was suffocating. Jake stood in the dimly lit hotel hallway, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at the two people who had just shattered his entire world. Emily's tear-streaked face was frozen in shock, her lips parted but no words coming out. Mark, his so-called best friend, still held his jaw where Jake's punch had landed moments ago. Jake's chest heaved. He could barely think past the roar of blood in his ears. Say something. His voice was raw, cracking under the weight of rage and betrayal. Emily flinched, then quickly shook her head. It's not what it looks like. Jake let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Not what it looks like. The words made his stomach churn. Oh, really? Then why the hell are you two sneaking around in a damn hotel? He took a step closer, his fury radiating off him like heat. Go on, Emily, tell me. Give me some bullshit excuse. I dare you. She wrapped her arms around herself, her body trembling. I swear it wasn't supposed to happen. It was a mistake. A mistake. Jake's voice was dangerously low now. His eyes burned into hers. You don't accidentally sleep with someone. You don't accidentally sneak around behind my back. So tell me, Emily, how long? She shook her head violently. Jake, please. How long? His voice cut through the air like a blade. She hesitated, her eyes darting to Mark for help. That was the final straw. Jake turned on his so-called best friend. You. Say something. Be a man for once and tell me the damn truth." Mark exhaled slowly, guilt shadowing his face. "Jake, it was just a couple of times." Jake's vision blurred with rage. His entire body tensed. "A couple of times?" The words felt like acid eating through his skin. "Oh, so that's supposed to make me feel better?" He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "A couple of times, huh? What, did you sit around and talk about how much of an idiot I am while you were screwing my girlfriend?" Mark's jaw tightened, his gaze dropping. He had nothing to say. Emily sobbed. "Jake, please, I never meant to hurt you. I love you." Jake felt something inside him snap. He let out a bitter, hollow laugh. Love? This wasn't love. Love wasn't sneaking around behind someone's back. Love wasn't lying, wasn't betrayal, wasn't this. "You don't love me," he spat. "You love the thrill, the secrecy, the sneaking around. You love knowing that you were getting away with it. But guess what?" His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "You're not getting away with it anymore." Emily shook her head, tears falling freely now. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean for this to happen." Jake's stomach twisted with disgust. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" His voice was thick with venom. "So, what was it, Emily? Did you just trip and fall into his bed?" Mark finally stepped in, his hands raised. "Jake, man, I swear." Jake's fury boiled over. Before he could stop himself, he lunged. His fist connected with Mark's face a second time, harder than before. Mark staggered backward, slamming into the wall. "You were my best friend," Jake roared. "I trusted you. I let you into my home, into my life. And this is what you do." Mark coughed, wiping blood from his mouth. "I never wanted to hurt you." Jake shoved him back. Don't you dare try to justify this." Emily tried to grab his arm, but he yanked away from her touch. He couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand the sight of her, the sound of her voice, the pathetic way she was trying to fix something that was already destroyed. "You're both dead to me." His voice was hoarse, filled with something deeper than just rage, pain. Mark hung his head, knowing there was no coming back from this. Emily sobbed harder. "Jake, please." But he was already walking away. Out of the hotel. Out of their lives. He didn't look back. He didn't need to, because nothing would ever be the same again. The apartment felt empty now. Not just physically, though the absence of Emily's presence was suffocating, but emotionally, mentally. It was a hollow shell of what once was. Jake sat on the cold floor, a half-empty bottle of whiskey clutched in his hand, staring at the suitcase he had barely unpacked in his new place. It wasn't home. It was just somewhere else. A temporary existence in a city that now felt foreign to him. The days blurred together. Jake didn't eat much. Not because he was trying to starve himself, but because the thought of food made his stomach twist into knots. Every bite felt like a chore. Every sip of water tasted like nothing. The only thing that had any effect on him was alcohol, numbing the sharp edges of his pain for a few hours before reality came crashing back down. Sleep was worse. He would close his eyes, and for a few fleeting moments, he could almost pretend nothing had changed. He could still hear Emily's laughter echoing in the apartment they had shared, feel the warmth of her body curled next to his in bed. But then the memories would come, like a wrecking ball smashing through his mind. The hotel hallway, the look of guilt on her face, the betrayal in Mark's eyes. Jake would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding as if he had just run for his life. But the real nightmare was being awake, facing the crushing weight of everything he had lost. The phone rang. Again. He ignored it. He always did. It was either his sister checking in on him or one of his friends who had heard what happened and didn't know what to say. Jake wasn't in the mood to be comforted. He didn't want to hear how it'll get better or you deserve better, because it didn't feel like it would get better. The betrayal had sunk deep into his bones, poisoning every memory, every thought, every feeling he had ever had about love and trust. He used to believe in loyalty, in friendship, in the idea that some bonds were unbreakable. Now he knew better. One night, he found himself standing outside their old apartment. He didn't know why he came. Maybe it was to torture himself, to see if she had already moved on, if she was already laughing with Mark in the very space they used to share. But as he stared up at the window, nothing happened. No lights, no movement, just silence. A part of him wanted to go inside, to see if anything had changed, if his scent still lingered in the air, if their old photos were still on the walls. But he knew better. Going back wouldn't fix anything. Nothing could fix what had been broken. His life had collapsed, and he had no idea how to rebuild it. The days had lost their meaning. Morning, night, it all blurred together. Jake had stopped checking the time, stopped caring about dates. He barely left his apartment, except when absolutely necessary. Most nights, he sat in the dimly lit living room, an untouched meal growing cold on the coffee table while he nursed yet another bottle of whiskey. The alcohol burned less now. He barely felt it anymore. But that was the point. The pain, the anger, the humiliation. It was all still there, buried deep beneath the surface, clawing at him every second. But the whiskey helped dull it, even if only for a little while. His phone buzzed again. He didn't even look at it. He already knew who it was. Friends who had given up trying to reach him, his boss wondering when the hell he was coming back to work, or worse, her. Emily had tried calling. She had even left a voicemail once, a week, trembling, "Jake, please talk to me." But he had deleted it before she could say another word. What was there to say? What was left to salvage? The betrayal had been too deep, too personal. Not just from her, but from Mark, his best friend, his brother. The thought of them together made his stomach churn. Did they laugh about it? Did they sneak around behind his back for weeks, maybe months, pretending everything was fine? A fresh wave of rage surged through him, hot and suffocating. He gripped the bottle tighter, his jaw clenched. At first, he had tried to make sense of it all. He had spent nights staring at the ceiling, asking himself what went wrong, what signs he had missed, if there was something, anything, he could have done differently. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't his fault. It was theirs. They had done this. They had made the choice to betray him. They had destroyed everything. And they had moved on. They got to move on. While he was drowning in this hell, while he was falling apart, they were probably happy. The idea made his blood boil. How was that fair? They had taken everything from him. His love, his trust, his sense of stability. They had shattered his world and walked away without a second thought. And suddenly, a new thought took root in his mind. Why should they get away with it? Jake sat in the darkness, staring at the wall, his mind racing. For weeks, he had been aimless, lost, letting the weight of the betrayal crush him. But now something else was taking its place. Something sharper, something darker. Revenge. It wasn't just an idea. It wasn't just an impulse. It was justice. Why should Mark get to play the perfect friend when he was nothing but a snake? Why should Emily be allowed to move on, to pretend like she wasn't a liar, a cheater, a fraud? Jake leaned forward, the dim glow of the streetlights casting shadows across his face. They needed to pay, not just with words, not just with guilt. They needed to feel exactly what he was feeling. The pain, the loss, the destruction. Jake exhaled slowly, his heart steady, his mind clearing for the first time in weeks. They thought this was over, but it was just beginning. Jake had stopped expecting anything good to happen. His days were a monotonous cycle of waking up with a hangover, ignoring messages, and sinking deeper into the black hole of his own thoughts. But then he saw her. It was late, nearly midnight, and he was sitting in the dim corner of a bar, his usual spot. The place was nearly empty, just the sound of clinking glasses and low murmurs filling the space. And then she walked in, At first, he barely recognized her. It had been years since they last met. But the moment their eyes locked, the past came rushing back like a tidal wave. Sarah, Mark's ex. She had been part of their lives for years, woven into the same circle of friendships. But that was before she and Mark had broken up, before he had cheated on her. Jake had never known the full story. Mark had downplayed it, made it seem like just another bad breakup. He had told everyone that Sarah was crazy, that she had overreacted, that she was too emotional. But now, seeing her standing there, he knew she wasn't crazy. She was like him, a victim of Mark's lies. Her eyes scanned the bar, and then she saw him. She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to approach, but then she squared her shoulders and walked straight toward him. "Jake," she said, her voice steady but cautious. He nodded, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. "Sarah." She sat down. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then she sighed. "So, I guess we both got screwed over by the same person." Jake let out a bitter chuckle. "Yeah, looks like it." She leaned forward, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "I heard about what happened." Jake tensed. "From who?" "Mutual friends." She rolled her eyes. "You know how people talk." "Of course." He should have known. Gossip spread like wildfire. Sarah took a slow sip of her drink before setting it down. "I've been through it, Jake. The lies, the betrayal. Mark's a snake. Always has been." Jake studied her. There was something in her eyes, not just anger, but a hunger. And then she said it. "I want to make him pay." Jake's grip on his glass tightened. The words sent a rush of adrenaline through his veins. For weeks, he had fantasized about revenge, about making Mark and Emily feel the same pain he had felt. But now, sitting across from someone who had been just as broken by Mark, the idea no longer felt like a fantasy. It felt like a plan. Jake leaned in. "What do you have in mind?" A slow smile crept onto Sarah's lips. "The plan." Over the next few days, they met in secret. Coffee shops, dimly lit bars, even late-night phone calls that stretched into the early hours. They pieced together everything they knew: Mark's routines, his weaknesses, the secrets he thought he had buried. And Emily? She was just as guilty. Sarah smirked as she scrolled through her phone, showing Jake an old screenshot of Mark's messages to another girl from when he and Emily had just started dating. "He's always been like this," she said coldly. "She thinks she's special, that he won't do the same thing to her." Jake clenched his jaw. She deserved to know. But revenge wasn't just about telling the truth. It was about destruction. And together they were going to ruin them. Doubt creeps in. But as the plan took shape, something unexpected happened. Jake found himself laughing again. Not the bitter, hollow laughs he had grown used to, but real laughter. Late one night, he and Sarah sat in his apartment, a bottle of wine between them, plotting their next move. Sarah told a story about how she had once hacked into Mark's fantasy football league just to mess with him, and Jake laughed so hard he nearly choked. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like he was drowning. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't alone, and that scared him. Because wasn't this supposed to be about revenge? Wasn't this supposed to be about making Mark and Emily suffer? But now he wasn't sure. The anger was still there. The pain still lingered. But with Sarah, it was different. She wasn't just an ally. She was becoming something more. And suddenly, Jake had to ask himself, was revenge really what he needed? Or was it just another way to keep himself from moving on? The night of the party had finally arrived. Jake stood near the bar, gripping his whiskey glass a little too tightly, his pulse steady but his mind racing. Around him, people laughed, music thumped through the speakers, and drinks flowed freely. It was the perfect setting, casual, lively, unassuming. Just how they needed it to be. Sarah moved through the crowd with effortless ease, laughing and clinking glasses with guests, her charm masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. She met Jake's gaze from across the room and gave a subtle nod. Everything was in place. Mark and Emily had arrived. Jake's heart pounded as he saw them step inside, hand in hand, looking every bit like the perfect couple. Emily's laughter rang out as she greeted people, her arm around Mark like she hadn't spent weeks sneaking behind Jake's back. Jake swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He had loved this woman. He had trusted this man. And tonight, that illusion was going to be shattered. The trap is set. The plan had been simple. A party, a crowd, a carefully timed reveal. Mark and Emily had no idea they were walking into their own execution. Jake had spent weeks gathering evidence, screenshots of messages, call logs, even a few damning photos Sarah had dug up from Mark's old hidden social media accounts. And now it was all about to come out. Sarah made her way to the center of the room, tapping a spoon against her glass. The chatter died down as people turned toward her. "Hey everyone, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to all of you for coming tonight," she said, flashing a radiant smile. "And a special welcome to Mark and Emily." Jake saw them exchange a glance, confused but grinning. They had no idea. Sarah continued, her voice light, almost playful. "You know, Mark has been such an important part of my life. And Jake's too. In fact, he's been like a brother to Jake." Jake smirked as a few people nodded in agreement. "But here's the thing about brothers," Sarah added, her smile darkening, her tone shifting. "You don't sleep with their girlfriends." A heavy silence fell over the room. Mark stiffened. Emily's face paled. Jake stepped forward now, holding up his phone. "Let's all take a little trip down memory lane, shall we?" With a single click, the Bluetooth-connected screen in the room lit up and displayed everything. Messages, photos, hotel bookings, dates, timestamps, evidence, undeniable, inescapable evidence. Gasps filled the room. Someone muttered, "Holy shit." Another whispered, "No way." Emily took a sharp breath. "Jake!" Jake turned to her, his voice razor-sharp. "How long were you going to keep lying, Emily?" "Right up until I caught you in our bed." She shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. I never meant." Jake cut her off. "Don't. Just don't." Mark took a step forward, hands raised. "All right, man, let's just talk about this." "Talk?" Jake let out a cold laugh. "Like how you talked to Emily behind my back?" He took another step forward, the tension thick enough to suffocate the entire room. "Tell me, Mark, was this your plan all along? Or was I just that blind?" Mark swallowed hard. "Jake, I swear it wasn't." "Oh, save it," Sarah interrupted, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you're the victim here?" She turned to the crowd. "By the way, fun fact, Mark also cheated on me. Repeatedly. Guess old habits die hard." The room exploded with murmurs. Mark looked like he had been punched in the gut. His reputation, his carefully curated image, was crumbling in real time. Emily, meanwhile, had covered her face, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. The weight of their betrayal, finally exposed for everyone to see, crashed down on them. The aftermath. But as Jake watched them stand there, humiliated, broken, powerless, something unexpected happened. He felt nothing. No relief. No satisfaction. No sense of justice. For weeks, he had dreamed of this moment. He had convinced himself that once Mark and Emily felt the pain he had felt, he would finally be able to move on. But now, standing there, staring at them as they stood frozen in front of a crowd that now knew the truth, all he felt was empty. Sarah turned to him, her eyes searching his. "Jake, we did it." "Yeah, they did. But why did it feel so hollow?" Jake exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Revenge hadn't healed him. It hadn't erased the pain. It hadn't fixed anything. He turned, heading for the door, ignoring the chaos unfolding behind him. Sarah called after him, But he didn't stop, because for the first time in weeks, he realized he didn't need revenge. He needed to let go. And maybe, just maybe, that was the only real way to win. The air was crisp as Jake stood at the edge of the ocean, his hands in his pockets, the cool wind brushing against his face. The sun had just begun its slow descent, casting streaks of orange and purple across the sky. The waves rolled in, steady and relentless, as if whispering a quiet reminder. Life moves forward, no matter what. For the first time in what felt like forever, he let himself breathe. It had been months since the night of the party, since he had walked away from the wreckage of his old life. He had left behind the anger, the revenge, the obsession with making them pay. Because in the end, none of it had set him free. It had only chained him to the past. Letting go. Forgiveness hadn't come easily. There were nights when he still felt the ghost of betrayal clawing at the edges of his mind, when he would wake up in a cold sweat, reliving the moment he had discovered the truth. But eventually, the pain lost its sharpness. One day, he realized he could think about Emily and Mark without feeling like he was suffocating. He could remember the good moments without bitterness, the bad ones without rage. Forgiving them didn't mean excusing what they had done. It meant choosing not to carry it anymore. Not for them. For himself. So one morning he wrote 2 letters, one to Emily, one to Mark. He kept them short, simple. I forgive you. I won't forget, but I won't let this define me. I hope you both find whatever it is you were looking for. Then, without a second thought, he burned them, because some things weren't meant to be sent. Some things were meant to be released. Finding himself again. The hardest part hadn't been letting go of Emily or Mark. It had been finding himself again. For so long, his identity had been wrapped around the people he trusted, the life he had built with them. But now, he had to ask himself, who was Jake without them? So he started fresh. He left the city, taking a job in a town by the coast, where everything felt quieter, simpler. He started running in the mornings, something he hadn't done in years. He picked up old hobbies he had forgotten, reading, photography, hiking. He made new friends, real ones, people who didn't know him as Jake, the guy who got betrayed. People who just saw him as himself. The first step forward. Now, standing here, watching the waves crash against the shore, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need answers. He didn't even need an apology. He had survived. And more importantly, he had moved on. As he took one last deep breath, he whispered to himself a quiet promise. Never again. Never again would he let someone else's betrayal define him. Never again would he lose himself in someone who didn't deserve him. Never again would he let pain dictate his future. With one final glance at the horizon, Jake turned and walked away, toward the next chapter of his life. And this time, he was writing the story on his own terms.